Yeah, I was working for the Jets, and I had been named the first female scout in the National Football League, and I've been working along for a while doing that. And my boss was on the road at the time, and the Senior Bowl was being played, and it was always coached by NFL coaches. And Walt Michaels was the head coach at the time, so we had one of the squads. Well, Mike Stensrud got hurt, and they needed a replacement, needed a defensive lineman. So my boss said, would you please look at some tape? At that time, it was reel-to-reel. There were no videotapes or anything of that sort, or computers or anything like that. So would you look at tape? Would you read all the reports on the guys, on different guys, and then come up with some players, and then after you look at that, make some phone calls on the players that you narrow it down to. So I proceeded to do that as quickly as possible, too, of course, and narrowed it down to about 6 players. And I don't remember all the names off the top of my head, but there was one, as I said, that really stood out, but I also had to make all the calls. And when I made the calls, this one young man stood out amongst all, because he said, I'm ready. Just tell me when to be there. I'm ready to play. He was full of enthusiasm beyond belief and just ready to go. And that was Mark Gastineau. And I looked at the tape. His speed was unbelievable. He was at a very small school, though, East Central Oklahoma, and he was projected to be around a 7th-round pick at that time. As I said, it was things where they did have the combines, but they did not have pre-draft physicals. They didn't have all the computers. They didn't have all those different things. So it was very different back then. So they brought him in. He played in the Senior Bowl. He stood out. He was the defensive MVP of the Senior Bowl that year in '79. And so he was drafted. Marty Lyons drafted number 1. Mark Gastineau was drafted number 2. And the rest was history.
Good find.
Connie, with that story, it proves you were not only able to break down tape, see the talent, but then also you had the ability to actually evaluate the player from another level. And as you said, the enthusiasm came right through the phone. And as we know, Mark's career, and he is the all-time sack leader, he played with that enthusiasm his whole career. We're going to go over to the next graphic, and it's a picture of yourself and Mark now, and it was very recently. And if you will, Connie, you were part of a scouting group in the 1970s. And if you can just, under your watch, if you can, for our viewers, just give us a brief list of NFL Jet players that your group drafted, because it's quite impressive.
Well, when I started working, as I said, I started out in '74, and at that time I was working as a scouting assistant type of thing. And then all of a sudden, Mike Holloway, who I consider very much, as I said, a genius, and he was an All-American at Boston College, and he played in the pros. And so at that time, that's when they named me a scout, along with Lee Bubank and Al Ward were the ones that gave me, they said, would you like to become a scout? And they sent me out to Ohio State and Boston College and Orange Bowl and a few other things. So we started doing that. And along with writing reports, they started bringing in some players to talk with them as to whether the type of player that you wanted. Well, I said, Mike Holloway taught me a lot during that time, and if you look at the draft of '76 and '77, from with those, there were Wesley Walker, Richard Todd, Marvin Powell, Abdul Salam, Joe Klecko, Scotty Durking, Kevin Long, Dan Alexander. I mean, you just go through.
Wow. That's a pretty good list.
And I'm not personally responsible. I'm not personally responsible, but I said that's where I learned under those tutelage and learned a lot that helped me along the way to further evaluate when I did films and everything else all along.
Well, you know, Connie, the '70s really were, in a way, golden years for that team. I mean, every year they were very consistent. They played with a lot of heart, and basically the reason why they were so good is because of the talent that was on the field that you and your group were in charge of procurement. We're going to go over to our next graphic, Connie, and now we're going to explain to our viewers the opening graphic. If when we introduced you, your name is Connie Nicholas Carberg. If our fans out there recognize the name Nicholas, your dad was the team doctor, Dr. Calvin Nicholas, and your uncle, James, was the famous surgeon. And we just put a picture up of your dad with Joe Namath. And Connie, when when you think of kind of being born into a family, and if you, let's say, Dad takes you to work, so to speak, I mean, I can't think of anything cooler than what you experienced. But before we get into your younger years, everyone that speaks of your dad, the Jet players, anything that we could get our hands on, research-wise, said how great of a man he was and how every player on the team loved him. Could you tell us about the player relationship with your dad, if you will?
Yes, as I said, when I was 12, that's when he became the doctor. Both he and my uncle, starting out as the Titans and then becoming the Jets. And back then, it was even more personal than it is now, because you knew the players were so close. It was a very close-knit group. And the players would come out to the house because his office was connected to our house where we grew up in Babylon, Long Island. And so the players were always out the house rowing. If we had a party together, if they came over to swim down the pool, down the street with us, we played tennis with them. And they loved my dad. My dad had the amazing bedside manner and was so caring about them and their families and taking care. And I just saw Winston Hill when I was there at the Ring of Honor, and he said to me, Connie, you know, your dad just always cared about everybody else. That's all he cared about, never about himself, putting all the players first, their health first, their families first, and that's the kind of guy that he was.
Wow. Connie, we're going to go over to the next graphic. You, again, in your younger years with Joe Willie Namath, and it's almost like he's standing there with his
part of the family.
Yeah, it's almost like a suburban couple. You have a little green dress on, and it looks like you're still like a, it's really amazing. But Anthony, let me ask you a question. Yeah. How big of a Joe Willie Namath fan were you? I mean, you were a teenager at that time. Well, the sideburns, the whole bit.
Connie, that's why I'm a Jet fan today. I was about 19, Super Bowl I, and just that whole atmosphere and watching him play and the charisma that he had, you just couldn't help being caught up in it.
Right, and exactly just what you said is so right. He had charisma when he walked into a room, and when we would go to the games, the away games, it was like it was the Beatles. There were people everywhere in the lobby, everywhere to see Joe. When he came in, it was a total thrill. When he came in the room, you knew that there was a star in the room. But he was totally amazing, especially with children. He knew sometimes adults wanted so much from him, but with children, he always signed autographs, and he always personalized everything. He always said, to so-and-so. From the time that he started, that he always liked to know who he was signing to, and he would be glad to sign anything, but he always liked to personalize it. But he was a wonderful, wonderful guy.
Connie, the Tebow mania today, I mean, even that, as big as it is, it pales in comparison to Joe Willie. No, he was not only the biggest star in New York, he was the biggest star in the country. He was the one, really, when you think about it, that started that crossover into celebrity, where he did endorsements, he did commercials, he dressed in pantyhose, he made movies. He was really a pioneer. Connie, when you went, let's say, for example, you went with your dad to work, Joe Namath's got his, arm around you. You go back to school, on a Monday. That's got to be pretty cool, no?
It really was. As I said, all the time. I mean, just the fact, and it carries on even to this day. Even I'm living down in Florida. Everyone, when the first question is, when you say that you've been with the Jets, the first thing is, did you know Joe Namath? And it still goes on forever, because to this day he still is so big. And when he comes up to the Jets, if he's at a function, still people mob him. When he comes into a room, people will leave the rest of the team or anyone else. He still is that big, and he always has time for everybody. That's what I always loved about Joe. And when I worked for the Jets in '74, his last year I think was '76, and he was at the complex all the time, out there, and I'd bake apple pies, and he'd come. It was, as I said, it was very different back then. And he'd come back and he'd eat, he'd eat with us back there, and it was a very friendly atmosphere. Things are a lot more business-like now, but back then things were just much more casual. And I was very, very lucky, and I knew I was lucky. It was just a great way to grow up. I never wanted to grow up.
Yeah. We don't blame you. We're going to throw a bit of a curveball in the production studio. We're going to go back to graphic number 1 if we can. Now that our viewers know that was Joe Willie Namath's knee brace, and it's in none other than Canton, Ohio, where it belongs, in the Football Hall of Fame. We're going to go back to that knee brace for a moment. Connie, just tell us, your dad, as the team doctor, has some very, very tough decisions to make. Is someone concussed? These are all very, very delicate issues, and your uncle being the surgeon for Joe Namath, helping design that knee brace, and then also when you think, and what we want to do is we want to get a couple of thoughts from you. Let's talk about the 1968-69 season when they actually won the Super Bowl. That knee brace, he wore that knee brace that our viewers are looking at during the season, correct?
Yes, yes. And when my uncle made that, it was really, it was an amazing thing when he came up and he was already injured, and my uncle had to do the operation. Those kind of things were so unheard of, to have somebody injured and to pay, it was a first big money guy, exactly, and for him to play and to wear the brace and the different injuries that he had. And my uncle was pretty much, how they all go to see Dr. James Andrews. Pretty much, he's kind of like the big orthopedist now. That's what my Uncle Jimmy, Dr. James Nicholas, was back then. He was the guy that everybody went to see when it came to knees.
Yeah.
Great story. That's a great story.
Connie, if you will, you traveled with the team. You were fortunate enough that in that magic moment where the Jets won the Super Bowl down in Miami, we're actually going to go over to graphic number 7, and it's your uncle on the field helping Joe Namath up. And as we know, man, look at that shot. We need 2 men just to pick him up. Connie, when you went down with your dad and your uncle, and I believe you stayed at the same hotel in Miami with the team, is that correct?
Yes, correct, down at the Galt Ocean Mile, right.
When all of the reporters were around Joe poolside, and he said, "Hey, man, not only are we going to win, I guarantee it."
That's it.
Connie, what were you thinking? I mean,
guy's crazy.
It's funny, when it happened at the time, we didn't know it was all happening. That it kind of came out kind of later, because I guess there was some kind of dinner the night before, and where Lou Michaels, which was Walt's brother, and Walt Michaels was the defensive coordinator of the Super Bowl. Back they did. You only had 5 assistant coaches at that time, 5 coaches total. We Bubank and 2 defensive coaches and 2 offensive coaches. And, so Lou Michaels was on the course with the Colts. And then there was all that thing going back and forth. And then when Joe did that, so there was there were only a few beat writers and then a few writers down in Florida. And then it just kind of happened. But I think, as it grew more and more through the years, you realize that statement, that guarantee that he made, was just beyond. That was nobody did that except Muhammad Ali back in those days.